Ash fell from the sky. Well, everyone, it's that time again to put on your mist cloaks, get your vials of metal. Hopefully you don't get some metal poisoning. But yes, today we are going to be talking once again about Mistborn. More importantly, we're going to be talking about Mistborn, the Final Empire, the book that really started it all in kind of this magical saga and series. I'm super excited. Now, one of the reasons why I decided to make this video is that Kelsier from Mistborn was put into Fortnite. Don't know how to feel about that. I mean, I did have fun watching the Survivor Hathsen dab and do funny dances. Don't really play Fortnite all that much, but it was still fun to have him in there. So I decided to reread The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson. I wanted to see if it still holds up. Does it have any ash on it from the many years that I haven't decided to read it? So I wanted to rediscover that. So why don't we check it out? For people that haven't read the book, here is a basic plot. We are on the planet Scadrial. On this world, ash rains from the sky during the day, and at night the lands are covered in thick layers of mist that many are afraid to enter at night. We are in the Final Empire, an empire that has ruled for over 1,000 years, and at its head, the Lord Ruler, a man that can't be killed, and many have tried, a living god. Our story follows Vin, a street urchin in the capital city of the Final Empire, who finds out she is what is called a Mistborn, a person that has magical abilities once they ingest metals, from super strength to super hearing to the ability to almost fly? And very quickly she is recruited by a former gentleman thief turned rogue for a simple job: steal from the Lord Ruler, bring down his empire, and possibly kill him. And what could possibly go wrong? And that is a very basic synopsis of the Final Empire. Now, when it comes to this, I'm not going to be giving any spoilers, but I think another way to get people into this book that might not read fantasy all that much is it's a heist story, but with magic. If you put it in that framework for people that are not used to reading fantasy, it is quintessentially a movie heist, much like Ocean's 11, The Sting, The Italian Job, or my personal favorite, The Hurricane Heist. Now, when it comes to Mistborn, I can talk about the good and the bad. Honestly, it's kind of intimidating. By the Lord Ruler, I don't even know really where to start. So I might as well start with the good. I think for me, the best things about the story is the magic system. Allomancy, in my opinion, is the best magic system ever put to page. And also, it's a silly magic system, but how Brandon Sanderson really works with it is fun. Because if I gave you just the basic plot synopsis of what it is people ingest metals and they get superpowers. To most people, that sounds very schlocky, sounds very bad, but how Brandon Sanderson elevates it, makes these rules, everything has a clear-cut rule to it, everything has a flaw to it, everything works in this grounded sense of reality, which for me is a very important thing, and I think allomancy is one of the reasons why in really modern fantasy, we have really detailed magic systems, because just how clear-cut it is, it has this legacy to it where when people talk about magic systems now, they usually talk about Brandon Magic System Sanderson. Everything about it is not wasted, and it's so detailed that when your brain starts to figure things out, it really does make sense. And when a rule is broken, most people can't accept that unless the characters can explain it. Otherwise, if it isn't there, it isn't going to be there. There isn't going to be like a wave of your fingers and poof, your problem is solved. No, all these have clear rules and settings, and for me, I really like that. Another thing that I absolutely love about this story is the characters. I love the characters in Mistborn. I find that when it comes to them, they're all different, they all have their own personalities, they have their own flaws, and I think that's a really important thing because when it comes to a heist story, I think the heist is almost the secondary objective, whereas when it comes to the characters, and these are the people you're supposed to root for who are basically quintessentially criminals, but you like them because you want them to succeed. And for me, I really like every single character. For me, my favorite character is Kelsier or even Spook. It's a lot of fun to see these characters grow and adapt within the story, especially within this crew environment. Much like a good heist story, everyone has a moment to shine. And also, when it comes to it, they're all interesting people because they all have their own hang-ups and flaws. And by the end of the story, you feel like you're a part of the crew, much like Vin is a part of the crew in many ways. And for me, I really, really like that when it comes to just the characters. I think Brandon Sanderson does a really good job with making their conflict and motivation. And in the end of the day, they seem like the people that you could grab a beer with and you would just want to high five and shake everyone's hand. And I think that's effective for having a good character. Another thing that I really enjoy about the story is the world building. I love the world building. Much like the magic, it really does go in depth and it really does connect. I'm not saying like the roads connect. I mean, I guess they do. I mean, there's maps and stuff that I'm sure someone got something wrong. They're like, wait a second. But what I mean by this is everything is grounded in a sense of reality for a planet covered in mist and also rains ash. You can actually believe that the place that you're living in is believable and it isn't silly. And I think that's a very important thing when it comes to the world building. It's not silly. You actually have a lot of in-depth detail between the politics, the religion, just the day-to-day life, just the class divide between the rich noblemen and the ska. And for me, I think that's a very important tool, especially when it comes to the story, because you know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, without even saying, that person's bad. You can easily tell within just how people live and their environment. And I think Brandon Sanderson does such an amazing job with this. And you'd be surprised when you read this book just how in-depth the world building is. Every small thing you think of and can imagine is in the story. And I think when you read it, it is a lot of fun to read this kind of world building because it's so in-depth. It reminds me a lot of, the King Killer Chronicle in many ways. It actually reminds me a lot of the Lies of Loch Lamora. And I love that so much because those are some good world building. And last, I think the thing that really stands out in this reread is the setups and payoffs. I think for me, Brandon Sanderson is the master of this, just because when it comes to everything, no detail is left on the table. Something you think is a thread, you're like, that doesn't go anywhere, might come back, or little comments. I think when it comes to me and the setup and payoff, everything does set up and pay off. There isn't a moment where you feel cheated. Setting it within a heist is so effective because when it comes to a traditional heist story in any movie, this isn't even really a spoiler, but usually in all these, you have this detailed plan, everything seems to be going well, and then there's a monkey wrench within the equation, and everyone has to scramble together to figure out how to add this to the plan or rework the plan on the fly, which honestly, Brandon Sanderson does this so expertly that it's one of my favorite heist stories, and especially when it comes to reading this, you will feel satisfied at the very end of this book, and everything feels earned, and I just love setup and payoff, because as a reader, you have expectations, and when an author doesn't meet that, you feel cheated. But when the author can figure out ways to actually surprise you, or maybe your expectations are up here, but really it's like a sleight of hand trick, that's what Brandon Sanderson does, and for me, I absolutely love that every payoff in this, well, pays off. Now we might as well get into the bad stuff. I think for me, this is more of the dust, or I should say ash of the book, that when it comes to a book that's kind of this old, I mean, I think of it as modern fantasy, but this came out, a while ago. Yeah. But this is kind of the stuff that I've noticed with this reread that kind of doesn't hold up as much, and necessarily they aren't bad or good, but it's just stuff that I've noticed that just doesn't age well. And you can see actually within Brandon Sanderson, because he writes so dang much, the progression of this and kind of where things get elaborated more within more of his stories. But this is kind of the bad of the Final Empire in a little bit. The first thing that hasn't really aged well, in my opinion, is kind of the gritty environment that opens up this book. I'm not to say that like the whole environment is gritty, but more of the setting in the beginning with kind of Vin as the street urchin who's kind of this, everyone's poor, everyone's super cutthroat, thieving kids are just rampant, very much like an Oliver Twist situation here. One of the reasons why it's kind of just, oh my gosh, is that at this time in the early 2000s when this book was written, this was actually kind of a trend if people don't remember this. But you would have these stories of these kids that are poorer than poor, again, super cutthroaty. We see this in the Night Angel trilogy, portions of the King Killer Chronicle. We see it in the Lies of Loch Lamora. I could keep going on and on and on. And especially when we're getting it from Vin's point of view and a female perspective of this, it becomes a horror show very fast. And you have this nihilistic view of the world in many ways, that everyone's terrible. And I mean, it is a great character progression for her, but when you're reading in this environment, it can be a little upsetting. And rereading this, I forgot just how upsetting it can actually be compared to the rest of the story, but I think that's kind of the point. But for me, it doesn't really hold up all that much, especially coming from a person that reads a lot of fantasy where you see this trope quite a lot, because it is a trope or a trend at this time. To a new person reading this book, it's really shocking, but for a person like me that has read a bunch of fantasy, like the Night Angel trilogy and King Killer Chronicle, the Lies of Loch Lamora, it just seems old hat. but here it just seems kind of just it needed to be there at this time, but it's just one of those things. Now the other thing that doesn't hold up, oh man, does this not hold up, is the romance. Brandon Sanderson cannot write romance to save himself. He did write Warbreaker, which is his most romancy story, and even that has some problems to it, which is a great story, but still has problems with romance. Is that when it comes to Brandon Sanderson with the story and it comes to romance, it's kind of really hard to read at times, and this is the first time again where I'm rolling my eyes, because how Brandon Sanderson conveys relationships, at least in this book, is that you have two people that love bickering to each other, and eventually they'll find feelings for each other because the bickering is more like their version of flirting. And for me, it just doesn't hold up all that much. I mean, when it comes to writing romance can be hard, especially when it comes to certain people, because everyone's perspective of romance and perception of it, more importantly, is different. And, you can have the Romeo and Juliet, you can have, hey, you meet up, the meet cute moments and that type of stuff. But here it doesn't work for me. And I think this is one of the fundamental reasons why every time I go to a bookseller's, doesn't matter where I go, for the majority of the time, I'm saying this as the majority because I go to a lot of bookstores, even now, as I started going again, is that I see Mistborn in the YA fantasy section rather than just in fantasy. I think because of these reasons, because a lot of the book at parts is devoted to the romance, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. But here, the romance just does not work. It's kind of bad. And for me, another thing that kind of has a little ash on it is the tone. Now, for me, I'm a weird anomaly because I picked this book up randomly because Barnes & Noble was closing. This is the first time of me doing the Cosmere, was picked up a book that was #1 and went home. But to some people, when you're trying to sell this book to people, the tone is a little different. I'm trying to think of this as a first-time reader when I was going through this, and the tone of this, I don't really know where to put it. Obviously, it's like epic fantasy, but people can put it into the YA fantasy, people can put it into romance, people can put this into dark fantasy for like the body horror of the Steel Inquisitors and kind of just the Lord Ruler and all the weird body horror. And I think everyone's kind of true in this respect because you can't really put this in a subgenre. It doesn't really go into a box. I think it's epic fantasy, but I can see why people put it in these different subgenres. And also it's like one of those things where you kind of have to be careful where you suggest this to people, because like it's like, oh yeah, this is fun adventure story where everyone has fun and stuff. And then you have people reading it and they're like, people getting spikes through their eyes, mass executions, horrible treatment of people. And then he's like, this other person's like, oh, it's a romance story. What? It's one of those things where it's kind of one of those things where the tone seems all over the place. But I think that's also both a charm of the book, but when it comes to suggesting it and recommending it to people, you just have to figure out the best way to recommend it. And that's one of the reasons why the tone's all over the place a little bit, because of all these dark themes, lighthearted tones, and you kind of have it in this romance, but also it's a heist story in many ways. And for me, it can be interesting. But I kind of feel like those are the things that make Mistborn such a fun and interesting story. For me, it is a thriller pacing type of story. I read it in 2 to 3 sittings. It's so much fun to read and just get really into that environment. Those things where you just gotta bust out like a smoke machine and just get cozy wozy. And hopefully if you live in California and ash is raining from the sky, you can have your 4D show while you're reading it. But I really, really love Mistborn. The Final Empire holds up really well. I love the characters, I love the magic system, I love the conflict. And in the end of the day, it's a story that holds up, and I hope that when it comes to Mistborn, it lives on for a long time. It has this legacy to it. It has this almost pedestal where a lot of fantasy books after that kind of have inspiration to, and it really does deserve it in many ways. Yeah, it has some ash to it just a little bit when it comes to the dust, but it's still a solid book. I recommend picking up this book, The Final Empire. Hopefully we actually get that movie that Brandon Sanderson was kind of writing. I would love a Mistborn movie, but hey, we got Kelsier dabbing in Fortnite. That's a plus. Well, everyone, thank you all so much for watching this video. You are all so amazing. I love you all so much. If you like this video, maybe consider subscribing, giving a thumbs up. I would really appreciate that. You are all so much fun. Well, everyone, thank you all so much for watching. And like always, may your food and drink ever be tasteful, and may your books be filled with fantasy and adventure. Bye, everyone. See ya.